As the Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition representative, I'm really going to focus on water. And let us remember what our First Nations friends remind us of all the time, which is water is life. I don't think about life without good, clean water. So every once in a while, I turn on your tap and think, wow, this is incredible. Hopefully you do get good, clean water out of your tap. It is quite amazing. So let's keep it. So numbers of concerns about impacts to water with this project. Very much like what Bill has been describing, where we have a situation where the government has basically chosen the route and then they do the studies, right? They update some studies. They've chosen the route and basically nothing I'm about to tell you will change their mind. No matter how much it costs, no matter what the impacts are, no matter what, we're gonna get it done right there. So one of our concerns is that they are not actually even studying the impacts to Lake Simcoe, this project. But it's a bit surprising because the minister, deputy minister of Ministry of Transportation came out in front of York Region Council and said, this project will not affect Lake Simcoe. And luckily, John Taylor and Mayor Quirk from Newmarket and Georgina, respectively, said, hang on a minute. We've been working on Lake Simcoe for decades, and we understand how the lake works. Gravity, water flows into the lake. How can you say this will have no impact on Lake Simcoe? And turns out they don't know that because they're not even studying it. So thank you. That was a deputy minister of the Ministry of Transportation of Ontario. Actually totally lied to York Region. So just an example of our days in the trenches watching this happen. For starters, the Bradford Bypass will cross 13 water courses. Lake Simcoe is already in trouble. There's a lot of, I'll get to that a little bit later. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the concerns from the 2002 EA, which is the most recent environmental assessment that we have, and what it said. I'm going to talk a bit about chloride contamination issues and water and groundwater and wells. The conditional approval of the EA in 2002 included conditions to have a requirement for stormwater and groundwater protection plans. Those were, now that the province has exempted itself, as Bill was saying, they've basically exempted themselves from doing an environmental assessment. I know you don't all know the ins and outs of how environmental assessments work. This is the first time I've worked on an environmental assessment, but what they're doing now is just using really old information, updating some studies, but relying on the old information to go ahead. So in this case, those studies from the past said they predicted very severe impacts to water and groundwater, surface and groundwater. The exemption really makes this requirement to do these plans pretty useless, and I'll talk about that a bit later. So they're doing plans, but they don't really say much, and they don't protect water. So, in the war against red tape, you got to wonder, like, where do they draw the line? Because there's some stuff that's worth doing and some that you're just going to make a study and then ignore the results. And that's kind of what we get here. The 2002 EA said that stormwater runoff has the potential to severely impact the quality and quantity of groundwater in the area. Just out of curiosity, how many people here are on a well within 500 meters of the Bradford Bypass? Yeah, so that will be affected. It also said that there is severe potential for loss of fish spawning habitat, including the northern pike spawning habitat. And of course, Lake Simcoe has a $420 million a year sustainable recreation sector, but it does rely on nice water and fish. So it's a bit short-sighted to ignore the health of Lake Simcoe, from an economic or environmental or human health or animal health point of view. So now I'm going to talk a bit about chloride contamination. So this is a page from a Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority study. They're showing what the future looks like. That's just 2031, the full build out of the growth plan, the plans for development to 2031. So based on the information the historical information, they've come up with this scenario. So what we're looking at here is actually everything that is green, below the green, lower than bright green, like lower down on this list, will have an annual average chloride concentration that is in excess of the chronic exposure guideline for chloride. So the chronic exposure guideline for chloride, that means how much salt can aquatic organisms be exposed to before they have negative impacts. So again, everything lower on that legend than the bright green is chronic. So that is where the little critters that feed the fish grow up. That is where the little fish grow up. I've heard people say freshwater organisms can adapt. They won't adapt in one generation, that's for sure. I mean, I think it takes thousands of years for things to evolve. So no, this is very bad for Lake Simcoe. This same study identified areas where the greatest increases have been predicted include your area here, south end of Cooks Bay in East Gwillimbury, particularly around Queensville. In addition, it says, in addition to being a focal area for growth in the Lake Simcoe watershed, the Queensville area is primarily in the headwaters of the Maskinonge River, which has characteristically low flows and limited groundwater. So relatively little dilution available for the salt that will come off the highway. Anybody who's been anywhere near the Maskinonge River knows that it's been like severely polluted for a really long time and really can't handle any more stress. Further, their study identified that they're expecting impacts in those areas of 45 out of 47 aquatic species. So that's almost all of them, right? It's more than 90%. So it's not illegal to use salt. There are guidelines about how to use it, and the people who apply it to parking lots and highways and everything, they get trained, but I'm sure we've all seen those giant piles of sand. It's really bad for our water. This is something that my group, the Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition, will be trying to get some more action on with other groups in Ontario over the next couple of years. This is really just a quick snapshot. This is Joelle Young, who is a Ministry of the Environment scientist who's worked on Lake Simcoe for a long time. This is her slide showing the chloride at the exit where water leaves Lake Simcoe at the north end of the Atherley Narrows. So this is the trajectory. This is the trend. I mean, it's a very clear trend. We are expected to be at the chronic threshold for the lake in 37 years. For the lake. So you kind of got to wonder, like, how much is too much, right? At what point do we say this is a bad idea? Because that's kind of the point I'm trying to make here. Also, this rate is increasing. The rate of salt pollution is increasing. They had already studied this. Now, the recent stuff says, oh, it's actually going to reach that threshold 11 years earlier than we thought. Okay, so it's really a big problem. We know that that highways are a problem for salt because the Conservation Authority studied the impacts before and after the 404 highway was built as it crossed over the Maskinonge River. Before the 404 was built, only 12% of water quality samples exceeded the chronic guideline. After the 404 was built, 84% of water quality samples exceeded the water quality guideline for salt. So, okay, on to the close to home topic of drinking water in wells. Okay, so the province had the MTO consultants, AECOM, have done this well water and groundwater study. At the end of the day, my biggest concern is, well, okay, there are real impact concerns, but also the process is really shoddy. Has adequate pre-construction information been collected? I would like to know, and I think the answer is no, because what they did was they sent out a survey and they only got 12% response. Problem with that is that they won't then know the baseline information about the quality of the water in the well at the beginning of the process. And that means certainly if anybody thought they were going to get any reparations from the government, if you can't demonstrate that your well has gotten worse, then you definitely won't. But that's okay because nobody will. Their plan is to just give you water until you fix your well. That's it. That's what you get. So the EA predicts severe impacts to groundwater. Definitely lots of very clear concern expressed in the government's studies about construction activity and its impacts on wells and groundwater as well. Yeah, this is all government information. We're just sharing this with you. It's just unbelievable. So this is what they have to do. This is what the exemption says about their groundwater protection and well monitoring plan. So what they do is they identify the areas that are going to be affected. They monitor the areas, and it sounds like the monitoring was kind of botched. A lot of the monitoring stations people couldn't get to, but they're monitoring it now. Then they have to describe the locations and what the water quality is like, and they need to say when it's going to start and how often they're going to do it, and then they're going to do a survey. That, my friends, is the groundwater protection plan. Do you see actual groundwater protection in there anywhere? I don't either. So then here's, okay, if you can believe it, the craziest part comes now. So, you know, the Bradford Bypass is going to go over the East and West Holland rivers, already full of salt. But of course, if you're going to build a giant highway on elevated piles over top of a river, you're going to need to put those piles into the ground. But as we've been pointing out, it's a wetland. And so it's really wet. And so they have to de-water the site as they dig. Okay. And who knows how long they have to do that for? We don't know. I don't think they know either. There's a whole lot of like, we'll get that detail sorted out in our final design. That is repeated in this study all the time. Okay, but turns out that groundwater that's going to come out in the construction phase is actually contaminated itself. It doesn't say it's like polluted, but it's got metals in it, and there are these parameters for what constitutes good, clean water that can be just released back to the environment. This groundwater does not meet that standard. This, to me, should be a bit of a showstopper. The fact that it's not gives you a really good indication of how this project is proceeding. So they're going to have to de-water, they have to treat the water, and then they have to put it into a sewer. But there's no sewer nearby because it's a river valley. So I have no idea, and there's no explanation. Like, what are they going to just take all the water and put it on a barge and then float it off somewhere else and then treat the water and then put it into a sewer? Like, this is actually a massive logistical problem, and I don't see any explanation about how they're going to manage that. Crazy. There are also lots of highly vulnerable aquifers in this area. This is just happens to be the densest. But you too can look at the wellhead protection areas and the highly vulnerable aquifers in the groundwater study. There is also a lot just a lot of wells just north of Bradford, and lots of vulnerable aquifers in the valley of the East and West Holland River and over towards the East Gwillimbury side, and where we are here. Back in 1998, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans did a preliminary review, and they concluded that this project would result in harmful alteration, disruption, and destruction of fish habitat, which is actually the thing that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is supposed to prohibit. But they've said this will be bad. Okay. They required a habitat compensation plan to address the removal of fish habitat. The MTO said no. They still refuse to adhere to the no net loss principle. for all the areas of fish habitat, stating that mitigation will occur where it is warranted and feasible. Those wiggle words are all over their studies. Where warranted, where feasible, if practical, if. So if you take one thing from, my final point is that their recent documents do say that there are no habitats of critical, threatened, endangered species in the area. However, the local First Nations have identified a couple of other species, the American eel and the northern sunfish, that they think, in fact, are in the area. I should note that the consultation with anybody in the public, including First Nations, who have treaty rights to fish and hunt and have clean water, because they live in Lake Simcoe and were put there, right? That they haven't been all that well consulted either. So we haven't been to any in-person consultations, and I assume none of you have either because they haven't been held. So we thought it was actually really a helpful kind of community service to be able to share this information with people, because all of this stuff is from government studies and the government is not really telling anybody about it. My next slide has a little bit of take action. Margaret is going to talk about this more at the end, but just in case people slip out before we get to the end, I do want to make sure if you're interested in getting any more information about this project and from us, from our team, then please sign up on the email list that Lori's holding up at the back. We send out an email about once a month or so, and you can follow us on social media as well. So I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it's better to know than to not know, and now you know. So I hope that this information helps inform you a little bit about the perspective that it's not just highway yes or no, it's how. How do we get this done? How do we get transportation problems solved in a way that's not going to wreck Lake Simcoe and the fish and all the things that live in it? Okay, thank you very much.